One benefit of being able to listen to audio is that you can still follow along with this message even while carrying on with whatever else you might be doing. Let's pray. God, please give me a soft and humble heart as I listen. Please open my eyes and my ears and change my spirit so I may know you and worship you in spirit and in truth. Before we begin, the burden of proof. Legally, in a murder trial, for example, the burden of proof is not on the suspect to prove his innocence, but on the prosecution to prove his guilt. This is where the idea that we are innocent until proven guilty comes from. In terms of the argument of God's existence, the ardent atheist declares that the burden of proof is on the theist for him to prove that God does indeed exist. This is like a defense attorney saying, "Prove my client is guilty of the murder." As a fitting aside, I'll tell you of a conversation I once had with a prominent defense lawyer. He was an older gentleman I began chatting with one night at the bar in our local Earl's restaurant back when my life revolved around going out, consuming alcohol, and hoping to meet women in the pursuit of empty pleasure. He was in town from one of the bigger Alberta cities for a case and was quite confident that he'd get his client off, as usual. So I asked him how often he was successful. His response? 95% of the time. Curious, I then asked him how often he believed his client to be guilty. His response? 95% of the time. Even then, when my own moral compass was so skewed, I saw this as a grievous injustice. To know you represented someone who was guilty, but work to keep them free. My friend, this tangent is fitting because in the case of God's existence, the client, so to speak, is 100% guilty of the murder. That our legal system dictates that a defendant must be proven guilty for him to serve a penalty has zero to do with his guiltiness when he has indeed committed the crime. If his clever defense, like the one I met in the bar, is able to get a not guilty verdict, this does not at all change that the defendant is guilty. In such a case, if the justice system was truly just, the burden of proof would not be on the prosecution, but would be on the defense, and they would be totally incapable of proving the innocence of their guilty client. This is exactly how it is with God. He is 100% existent. He is 100% the God revealed through the scriptures of the Holy Bible. The burden of proof does not lie on the believer to prove his existence when it is already a fact. It lies on the atheist to prove he is right in his position that there is no God. But this is simply something he can never do, not when God exists. The only hope the atheist has is to continue whittling away at the functioning of the natural world, trying to explain away the necessary role God has had in it. He attacks ancient beliefs and ignorance and points out that we now understand God isn't causing lightning, and now we know God isn't responsible for this and for that, and one day we'll see God isn't required for anything we experience. This reasoning demotes God to being, quote, the God of the gaps, end quote, alluded to earlier in philosophical naturalism, meaning he is merely a temporary filler men rely on to solve how things naturally occur. They think that scientists and modernity will eventually reveal the true explanation for us. But this venture still doesn't help the atheist in his case for two reasons. One is that at best, it only works to show that the reality God has constructed for us to exist in functions seamlessly thanks to the natural laws he put in place. Ultimately, this still doesn't negate his existence. This is like a person riding their bike to work when they have a car in their garage and their coworkers saying, "See, I told you they didn't have a car." 2. Just because people in the scientific community introduce some theories as to how something operates and declare God isn't necessary for that operation does not mean they're correct and that they've indeed solved the mystery which we wrongly assumed necessitated God's involvement. It's entirely possible and happens frequently within science, they'll discover later that they were wrong, and they'll have to revise or even discard the theory. Besides, in the end, not all things can be eliminated as not requiring God's interaction anyway. Furthermore, if there was no evidence whatsoever for the existence of God, the atheist might have a case. But the amassed evidence is so clear as to who God is, it really is silly when the skeptic brings some scientific theory to the table and states God wasn't necessary in that instance in nature. That does nothing to all the evidence pointing to God, nor is it damaging when they put forth some historical, cultural blunder done by men and blame that on God not existing as well. Neither can atheists reject the reasonable inferences from all the evidence we do have simply because there may possibly be some evidence we do not have, but which they demand we produce. Otherwise, no amount of evidence would ever be enough. Please recall, we are working towards a proposition being true beyond a reasonable doubt. Another error the atheist makes is when they don't look at the evidence plainly for what it is, but begin inventing all manner of alternate possibilities to explain away the evidence. This can be called what-ifing something to death. It's just a tactic to excuse themselves from having to deal with what's unmistakably before them. It's juvenile because it avoids what is reality. It's irrational because it introduces factors with no reason for their inclusion. It's also counterproductive and stalls the discovery of the truth. Similarly, beware that persuasive arguments, regardless of how refined, are not, in and of themselves, evidence. They're meaningless. But they're also numerous via books, the internet, and especially YouTube. In the last several years of study while growing with the Lord, I've been exposed to so much material opposing the truth that we can know God. It's near always presented by smooth-talking, self-assured people. Yet the evidence is poor and unconvincing and sometimes skewed or an outright lie. Often, there is no evidence at all. It's just someone delivering ideas and philosophies they've come across or invented. The awful thing about the atheist agenda is just that there is an agenda at all. Why do they seek to bring others into their belief system? What does it gain them? Why not let bygones be bygones and sit back passively if government employees feel inclined to put out a nativity scene in front of their office? Why pressure corporations to prohibit their employees' freedom to wish people a Merry Christmas? Their hope is to liberate themselves from Christianity. They no longer want to be reminded of the God who created them and whom they are fully accountable to. But like philosophical naturalism being nothing more than a means of denial which does not save, this of course is a false and damning liberation. This brings us to what are known as risks of error. In any investigation of a proposed idea, the outcome is either true or false. If the investigation is conducted correctly, we'll arrive at some truth. If, however, the investigation is poorly executed, or in this case, approached improperly, we'll be exposed to two potential types of errors. Type 1, the acceptance of a false proposition, or type 2, the rejection of a true proposition. For the sake of our investigation, we don't want to accept the false proposition that God does not exist, and we don't want to reject the true proposition that He does exist. Further, we also don't want to arrive at a false understanding of God, nor do we want to reject what is true about Him. Therefore, not only is the burden of proof on the atheist to prove God does not exist, it is also the burden of proof for the atheist to search out and discover that He does. If the atheist dies mortally in this life, they will finally realize they were wrong in their position that God does not exist, and they will wish for the remainder of eternity that they had been right. For the believer, what demands they substantiate that they are right? Nothing. So what if they're wrong? What do they gain if they're wrong and they realize this? They find out they lived their entire life for a God who was not there, and they die and there's no afterlife. So what if they missed out on a life where they were their own authority and they behaved exactly as their temptations commanded of them? That is of little consequence for them. Again, the burden of proof is not on the believer. But my friend, please understand that firstly, having a saving relationship with God is not about determining to be good and do what is right in this life. It is one where the heart is actually changed by God to desire what is good and be repulsed by what is evil. There's no way for a true believer to no longer believe in God. If they were able to walk away, they were never a true believer. As well, there's no way for them to suddenly enjoy evil again. If they do, that too would again prove they were never a true believer. A faith in God that says, well, if I'm right about God's existence and who He is, good, and if I'm wrong, at least I've lived a good life as a nice person, is no faith at all. Soon we'll be discussing what faith is and what it is not. But no true believer thinks like this. We believe because God called us to Himself and we know Him. Nothing can undo that. Quote, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, end quote, from the book Cosmos by astronomer, astrobiologist, astrophysicist, and cosmologist Carl Sagan. As you venture on in this discussion, my friend, you will hopefully see from the wealth of evidence that God surely does exist. The burden of proof shall always remain upon the atheist and the skeptic, because what is so extraordinary in requiring extraordinary evidence is the claim that God is not. Thanks for listening to this video, and I hope that it blesses you. Please do share it with others so they may have the opportunity to understand this incredible truth. Be blessed.